Just for you to know, we'll be recording the webinar just to broadcast it afterwards.
Real.
Great pleasure, Barbara. One minute and we will get started.
Hi, Patricia.
Five minutes, I guess it's okay for us to get started. So first of all, good morning and good afternoon for you, Dan, and whoever speaking from Europe or Brussels. First, I just make an introduction of this webinar, and then I'll introduce the panelists. As an economist, a practitioner in antitrust, I have always, not always, but time and again, felt a bit uncomfortable, so to say, or frustrated sometimes with efficiencies. We are requested to prepare many documents, some of them very dense. And time and again, we have seen the results are quite frustrating because the authorities would not rely on it, so to say. I'm being a bit unfair, I know, to Jeremy and Patricia, but just to get a bit of the feeling, of the mood about our theme. And some weeks ago, I just have my attention drawn to a paper. It's a presentation, but it's not a paper developed as a paper at the FTC site by Commissioner Christine Wilson. And Jeremy has been an advisor for this, so I just contact the commissioner's people to invite them to if they will be interested in preparing a webinar, and so this is how it began. Then I reached out. Patricia, who kindly accepted to join us, and then I asked also some practitioners, Maggie Segal from Cravath at New York, and then Curly from Cleary at Brussels. So we have this very qualified panel here to discuss a kind of a technical issue, but sometimes not so technical. And I guess we can feel at home here. I'll just ask everybody to turn off cameras and mics. We will suggest here Jeremy as co-author, so to say, of the paper to jumpstart our discussion. He'll talk a bit about this paper prepared by Christine Wilson, and then we will have comments from the panelists, and then my colleague Silva. Sorry, Silva, I have not introduced you. The two of us will be moderating here to get the discussion as free as our friends would allow us. So that this is all I have to do. Just a slight comment on efficiencies and this frustration that comes time and again. Efficiencies are always presented as like a minus, so to say. We have lots of harm and a bit of compensation from efficiencies. I'm talking about, of course, of complex cases here, merger cases mostly. The rule is you have to balance harm and efficiencies and try to figure out if the transaction would be cleared, or if it would be needing remedies or even to be blocked. The fact is, and this is what coming from an authority, it strikes me to see that it's not only me that sometimes gets frustrated of the efficiencies work not being, so to say, fairly recognized sometimes, even though everyone kind of take for granted that we do have efficiencies anyway. Even in the exercises we do, we always make a presumption about some efficiencies presented at the merger. So, but when we are scrutinizing the paper explicitly presented to quantify and to specify efficiencies, most of the times, or sometimes now and then, the paper is not taking into account and sometimes just outright dismissed. So this is why I guess this would be a good discussion here. I guess this kind of situation is not presented just in Brazil. Of course, it's I guess we have a wide view here, and this is what I think would be interesting for everyone, and I hope you all would enjoy and have some fun. And thank you all for being together. And please, Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Bernardo, and thanks to LCA for the invitation. I appreciate it. I am a government employee, and so I have to begin with a standard disclaimer that the views I express are my own and not necessarily those of the Federal Trade Commission or any individual commissioner. That said, So I'm here to talk about asymmetry in treatment of harms and efficiencies. And I would begin with the observation that antitrust assessment of harms from mergers or conduct is almost always probabilistic. When we project future harm, we do so under uncertainty, using the best information available to us. But we know that our projected harms may or may not realize. I don't view this probabilistic approach as inappropriate. What else would we do? And the probabilistic approach is indeed enshrined in U.S. law. In the Brown Shoe decision, the court talks about how antitrust is concerned with, quote, probabilities and not certainties, and speaks of probable anti-competitive effect as a scheme for whether a merger is legal or illegal. And I think, to some extent, the structural presumption in the U.S. is arguably an attempt to work this uncertainty into a manageable standard. However, in contrast, I view assessment of efficiencies as seeming to require something close to certainty for efficiencies to be credited. The U.S. horizontal merger guidelines state that, quote, efficiency claims will not be considered if they are vague, speculative, or otherwise not be verified by reasonable means. They go on to say that, unlike projections of harm, quote, projections of efficiencies may be viewed with skepticism, particularly when generated outside of the business planning process. So we have that kind of enshrined in our guidelines that we're going to look at efficiencies skeptically. How does it play out? Well, we have some data on this. There's a paper by Malcolm Coate and Andrew Heimert that survey confidential internal FTC recommendation memoranda, and they find that FTC staff economists' memos credited 27% of merging parties' efficiencies claims. The staff attorneys' memos credited only 11.9% of such claims. And tellingly, FTC staff attorneys credited efficiencies claims in 15% of closing recommendations, 7% of matters that went to litigation, and 4% of matters that were settled. So I think Joe Clemens and Dan Crane put it nicely in a 2009 article when they said, quote, to the extent the agencies talk about efficiencies, it tends to be in a derogatory way. The only real significance of efficiencies today seems to be as evidence that something other than market power motivated the transaction. Me to suggest that the same efficiencies evidence will be taken more seriously when the FTC wishes to close an investigation. Now, don't get me wrong, there are public matters and non-public matters where at least the U.S. agencies have cleared the matters as a result of credible efficiencies claims. However, when a matter gets to court, when it's litigated, both the agencies as plaintiffs and I think courts tend to minimize the importance of efficiencies. As recently as 1998, the FTC has argued in court that the law does not permit any efficiency defense at all, that they are irrelevant. And even today, the FTC, at least from my vantage point, tends to proceed in litigation by minimizing the importance and magnitude of efficiencies. So perhaps little has changed since 1999, when future FTC Chairman Tim Uris characterized the agency's attitude in litigation as one of unrelenting hostility to efficiencies. To some extent, agency hostility seems to have spread to courts. I found a study by Jamie Pennicoff-Moffett that found that even when, quote, courts claim to be balancing merger-generated efficiencies with other negative factors affecting market competition, they're actually making an assessment of the relevant concentration in the applicable market and allowing that initial assessment to color their recognition of claimed efficiencies. Indeed, even when courts do explicitly consider efficiencies, some courts go out of their way to emphasize that efficiencies were not visible to their decision. So to take one example from the public record of asymmetric treatment of harms and efficiencies, in 2014, the FTC considered the merger of two glass container manufacturers, Ardagh and Saint-Gobain. The parties produced some evidence of overhead reduction and operational synergies that would result in savings. The FTC's complaint stated that, quote, nearly all of the claimed efficiencies were non-cognizable. However, in one minority commissioner's view, who had reviewed the confidential record, expected efficiencies were 6 times greater in magnitude than expected harms. In this commissioner's view, it was impossible to reach a determination that harms exceeded efficiencies without applying an asymmetric standard about what should and shouldn't count on each side of the ledger. Consider an example of how courts treat efficiencies. So in 2004, the FTC litigated a coal merger, Arch and Triton. They lost. The court found the FTC's affirmative case, quote, far from compelling, and found that it was unlikely the merger would increase the likelihood of tacit collusion, as the FTC had alleged. The court seriously grappled with efficiencies and found that the merger would likely result in at least some efficiencies. However, they found the efficiencies were insufficient to, quote, support a full defense on efficiencies, despite the weak affirmative case. So to take one example of the court's reasoning, that court found that one of Arch's claimed efficiencies, that the combined company could more cheaply insure Triton's mines than Triton could individually. They found this was not merger specific because, quote, another purchaser of Triton might be able to achieve the same savings. So the terms merger specificity and verifiability and cognizability, at least in the US, they're in the horizontal merger guidelines. They were introduced ostensibly of clarifying the type of information that merging parties would need to present to substantiate efficiency claims. But in practice, I think merger specificity in particular seems to require something close to impossible. It seems to require a demonstration that there would not exist even one other company anywhere in the world that could achieve the same cost savings. So let's zoom in on this particular issue of merger specificity with an example. Let's suppose there are 2 companies, A and B, either of which would realize $50 million in annual cost savings by purchasing company C. Let's suppose that A, B, and C compete to some extent, and that either an A purchasing C or B purchasing C would result in some consumer harm from upward pricing pressure. Let's say that's $10 million of harm. So either purchase, we have $50 million in efficiencies and $10 million in harm. And that $10 million in harm is kind of if we ignore efficiencies before accounting for efficiencies. So a merger specificity standard in practice may require us to discount the cost savings from either merger as irrelevant, even if doing so would prevent a merger that would be efficient, because the efficiencies would be greater than the consumer harm. And you might say that the U.S. horizontal merger guidelines, for example, state that efficiencies are merger specific only if they are, quote, unlikely to be accomplished in the absence of either the proposed merger or another means of anti-competitive effect. So perhaps these efficiencies do not get discounted because the other merger would have the same anti-competitive effect. But if that's true, who bears the burden of demonstrating that a hypothetical merger that has not even been proposed would have, quote, comparable anti-competitive effect? And how can this demonstration occur absent a full investigation? So in practice, anytime plaintiffs or courts can locate a hypothetical purchaser capable of achieving similar savings, even credible and immediate efficiencies seem to be disregarded. Of course, I could see some merger specificity screening. So for example, if the claimed deficiency is just that the A side has access to some commonly available technology that the B side hasn't bothered purchasing for itself yet, that doesn't seem like a merger-specific efficiency. The B side could just go buy it. But it seems silly to require companies to demonstrate a negative, that there is no other company that could realize similar savings through merger. So I have a recent law review article about the merits of the consumer welfare standard as a baseline for antitrust enforcement. And at least as an economist, I tend to approach any antitrust issue with the ultimate effect on consumers at the top of my mind. And so if consumer welfare, and not some amorphous set of structural criteria or some loosely defined set of political goals, is to be the lodestar guiding antitrust enforcement, I don't see any good reason for the divergence between treatment of harms and efficiencies. Efficiencies benefit consumers just as much as upward pricing pressure created by, say, a merger harms them. And one thing I would point out is, horizontal mergers result in upward pricing pressure. Yet we allowed substantially all of them. I looked at US data, and there's roughly 2,000 reportable US mergers a year, and we challenged or settled maybe 2% of those. So 98% we allow. There's a debate on whether there's systematic under-enforcement or not, but I've not seen systematic evidence of that. So why are we comfortable with allowing 98% of mergers? So in my view, it's quite likely that courts and agencies in practice apply what Joe Farrell and Carl Shapiro call, quote, a standard deduction. And what I mean by that, or what they mean by that, I think, is blocking only mergers or conducts that are expected to raise price by more than some baseline amount. And so, in other words, we might allow a 7-to-6 merger because it won't, not because it won't affect incentives, but because the effect is likely to be so small as to be swamped by efficiencies. And so if we're okay with, we have sort of broad comfort with there being at least some efficiencies that we allow all of these mergers with relatively minor competitive overlap, what seems to me to stand in contrast to how agencies and courts view efficiencies when we litigate matters or even unsettled matters. And the treatment of efficiencies by courts and agencies, I think, probably affects the incentives of merging firms to prepare efficiencies presentations, because it's expensive to prepare these presentations. It may require a clean team, it may require consultants, and you may as well just not do it. In fact, in 2002, while serving as FTC chairman, Tim Mira stated that attorneys sometimes advise clients not to bother with expensive efficiencies defenses, given the low probability that they will affect anything. And if companies don't bother to incur this expense as a general matter, when it feeds into how agencies and courts see efficiency presentations, right? Because if the efficiency presentations are relatively lower quality, agencies and courts may rationally downgrade their view on efficiencies, and that leads to a vicious cycle in which the incentive to create good efficiency presentations is further degraded as agencies tend to discount them after seeing bad presentations. So to get out of this vicious cycle seems undesirable to me. I think we should try to get out of it, and to do so, I think, well, as a first order thing, we'd have to treat harms evidence symmetrically with efficiencies evidence. So, for example, just as qualitative or suggested evidence of harms can be a valid basis for an inference that consumers are likely to be harmed by a merger, efficiencies analyses, even if uncertain, should not be dismissed by courts or agencies merely because they represent a best guess about an uncertain future. However, just a mere adjustment to symmetric treatment may be insufficient, given that so much of agencies' work is unpublic. And the FTC's work tends to be public when we litigate cases, and we might get a ruling that embraces efficiencies is likely to be only when we lose cases, which is not all that often. The one idea, and this was what Commissioner Wilson was pushing in her June speech, was for the FTC staff to publish gold standard efficiencies analyses that would describe projected efficiencies in one or more hypothetical cases. And these hypotheticals could include examples of claims that do and do not meet the agency's bar for verifiability and merger specificity. And by setting clear goalposts for merging parties, I think the agencies would have more credibility when there was a need to dismiss weak claims. And this may incent, being clearer, more transparent about what it would take for the agencies to credit an efficiencies claim, I think would incentivize merging parties to incur greater expense to get across the goal and meet the standards set by the agencies for higher quality efficiency presentations. So with that, I will turn it over to the rest of the panel. I'd be very interested over the course of the panel of hearing any ideas that anyone on the panel or in the audience may have about what sort of guidance would be the most useful to practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for your first comments. introducing the paper or speech from Commissioner Wilson. Well, let's move forward. Patricia, would you like to start bringing your additional comments, initial comments, actually? Thank you.
Just for the audience, I have just post the link of the paper at the comments.
Chat.
Yeah, the chat, yes.
Okay, so good morning or afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you today to discuss this thought-provoking speech or paper by Commissioner Christine Wilson with such distinguished panelists. Thank you also, Bernardo and Silvia, for the invitation and for organizing this very interesting discussion. Before I continue, let me also make the usual remarks that the views expressed today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of CAGI. So, given that, let me make a couple of comments regarding the paper. First, I really enjoyed reading Commissioner Wilson's remarks, and may I also extend my congratulations to both Commissioner Wilson and Jeremy. And one of the reasons I enjoyed the paper is that the challenges she described are very similar to the ones we face in Brazil. I have divided my comments in two main topics. The first, with a focus on the treatment of efficiencies in Brazil and the incentives to present efficiencies in merger analysis. And the second, on the asymmetrical treatment of anti-competitive effects and efficiencies. So let's start with the first one, the treatment of efficiencies in Brazil and the incentives to present them in merger analysis. As Commissioner Wilson states, given that the standards of efficiency claims to be accepted are so high, parties may not have the incentives to invest in expensive clean teams and consultants to provide high-quality efficiency analysis. So could we say that this also applies in Brazil? I leave this answer to Bernardo and Silvia, representing the parties whose remarks I certainly like to hear, although in the beginning of the panel, Bernardo already stated that he was a little bit frustrated. Yes. It will be interesting to hear your further comments on that, Bernardo.
Just a bit. Yeah.
From the authorities' perspective, let me present some practical aspects of merger analysis in Brazil, particularly on the timing of the presentation of efficiencies. So, as a rule of thumb, parties tend to present efficiencies only later on in the merger analysis, usually after CAGI declares the case complex. This declaration of complexity happens after around 90 days of analysis by the superintendents, where I work as deputy superintendent. So in the case of Brazil, it is probably this declaration of complexity that generates incentives for firms to work on efficiency claims. The declaration of complexity reveals that there are pending aspects to be further investigated. That is, that anti-competitive effects derived from the merger have not been discarded. So at this phase, parties might then resort to all possible arguments to argue for the absence of net competitive harm, including efficiency claims. Of course, this is not always the case. We recently had a case, I think most of you of the Brazilian lawyers you'll know, involving Nike and sports retailer Centauro. It's still under judgment, in which parties decided to focus on other aspects of the operation, which had been pointed out by CAGI as worrisome, rather than their efficiencies. This could possibly be regarded as a reflection of Commissioner Wilson's remarks that that parties would disfavor efficiency analysis when allocating resources for the case. At the same time, while efficiencies have high standards to be accepted, we at CAGI certainly encourage firms to present them. And ideally, this should not be done only after the declaration of complexity, but from the very beginning in the notification of the operation. And the reason for this is that efficiency analysis tends to provide very valuable insights into the operation's rationale, which can be very helpful for a smooth case instruction. In this sense, I would say that not accepting efficiencies as presented does not imply that the authority is dismissing them. So maybe this is something that parties also acknowledge and that might also provide incentives for them to present efficiency claims. Now, let me move to the second point regarding the asymmetrical treatments of anti-competitive effects and efficiencies. I certainly agree with Commissioner Wilson that efficiencies and anti-competitive effects should be treated symmetrically to calculate the net expected effect of the merger operation on competition. Having said that, I also believe that parties' information regarding anti-competitive effects and efficiencies are not symmetrical. What I mean is that parties, of course, have the incentive to overestimate efficiencies and to underestimate anti-competitive effects. So when undertaking its analysis, agencies should probably take this information quality asymmetry into account. Besides, information regarding anti-competitive effects are more likely to be checkable by means of market tests and alike. Efficiency claims, on the other hand, tend to be harder to be evaluated, as we have to rely a lot on the parties, most of which are also restricted by confidentiality. So, all in all, it's my belief that anti-competitive effects and efficiencies should be treated symmetrically in the sense that the two effects have to be equally considered. In other words, we should consider the net effect between expected anti-competitive effects and expected efficiencies. At the same time, the calculation of the expected effects should take into account the asymmetries between these two types of information. So maybe one important question might be whether we are doing this properly. So using Jeremy's example, when we had 50 million efficiencies and 10 million harm, maybe what we have to consider is the net probability, yes, of this. So the probability of this 50 million efficiencies to take place and the probability of this 10 million harm to take place. Maybe the way we are assessing this probability is something that we should better consider it, but that the two should be taken equally as equally important, that I completely agree with. So these are some of my initial thoughts to get the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I tend to agree with you that here in Brazil, we do not have all the incentives to present the synergies right in the beginning. In generally, the parties only present the synergies once CADE or SCG ask them to do so, so they're obliged to do so. And it only happens usually when they are considered complex. And I understand this point because it's very time consuming. It's very difficult to do this kind of assessment. So we're doing this a lot, and we know how hard it is, how expensive it is for the parties to develop this analysis. I don't know if Bernardo has some remarks to do about his frustration in doing this kind of economic opinion.
Later on.
Okay, so I'd like to move on and invite Maggie to do some initial remarks.
Sure, thank you. I really enjoyed the paper and very much agree with the observations that it makes and that Jeremy made about the asymmetry. I found, just from a practitioner's perspective, it was interesting to think back on my experiences with some transactions where efficiencies were a huge part of what the parties themselves were doing just on their own, and how we use that as part of the process, and other transactions where we basically didn't even raise it whatsoever with the regulators, and how that has impacted the reviews. I mean, as I said before, I think the point that the paper makes and that Jeremy made is absolutely right, which is I think you don't see parties doing all the work that needs to be done to really dig into what efficiencies are and what could result from the merger. just for the purpose of the review by the regulator. That I've only used them personally in merger reviews where the parties otherwise were doing them for their own purposes. They had hired a consultant. They just happened to be companies, companies have different personalities. And so some will do them because they want to be prepared ahead of time and they bring in outside experts to work on them. But it's really only been in those circumstances where there was a kind of another reason for doing them that we have then incorporated them into our work with the regulators. I thinking about just the how they've actually impacted the merger reviews I've done. What comes to mind for me is this inherent skepticism you see from the legal side of the regulators when it comes to efficiencies. And I think that comes from a few different things, and the paper mentions it, and I think Jeremy referenced it too, which is, historically there has been just outright hostility to efficiencies. And I think in some instances it's because when you think about when regulators think about efficiencies, I think there's this automatic assumption that when you think about cost-cutting efficiencies, what that really means is cutting costs and just increasing your purchasing power upstream, or that when you think about revenue synergies, all that really means is raising prices. I think you have these knee-jerk reactions that efficiencies essentially just mean ways for the merging parties to make more money, and that I think that there is a skepticism. So there's a skepticism about what the efficiencies are themselves. I'm not saying these are informed by any kind of factual basis, but I think you just get that knee-jerk reaction at the regulators. And then there is a skepticism, and this I do understand more, that in the cases where you have potential anti-competitive effects, so where there has been shown to be some kind of incentive or ability to raise prices, and then you're looking at, well, how do you weigh the efficiencies? I think there then also is a skepticism that that the parties will actually pass along the efficiencies, that where you have the power to raise prices, you also have the power to just hold on to those savings and increase your margin. I think that is what the kind of inherent reaction and why you see the skepticism and the asymmetry of efficiencies that you do. So all of that, I think, is ultimately, and I think part of the reason for the asymmetry is that there's a skepticism that efficiencies actually mean pro-competitive effects. So what I'm trying to come back to is thinking about this from my perspective, how it fits into the legal of the way the regulators will evaluate a merger. And I think you have just kind of an understanding that the ability to raise prices, of course, that's going to be an anti-competitive effect. But I think that there is you still see skepticism about that efficiencies will actually be pro-competitive effects, that they will be passed on, that there is the same benefit to them. And I think about the instances in which, in my own personal experience, we've had the most success with efficiencies being credited are instances where we also were able to show that for example, in the acquirer's prior acquisitions, they projected certain efficiencies and then they achieved them. And that you saw those passed on and you saw price decreases. We're able to show essentially, look, we've done this before, and here's how we projected them, here's how they were achieved. Where we could show that evidence, there was a lot more, the agencies were more welcome to our efficiencies claim in that particular merger. So to be able to reassure them, we've done it before and we're going to do it again. So I think that is one way that it has at least helped me see how do I help get over this inherent skepticism of what the efficiencies are and that they will be passed on to consumers and will be pro-competitive effects. What I think, and then thinking about kind of the second part about, I very much agree that I think having more articulated standards and examples of here are the types of efficiencies that we can credit, having the same type of kind of goalposts of what efficiencies, what parties could show for the regulator to credit the efficiencies more. I do think essentially trying to find some way to have a common understanding of what types of why efficiencies do result in pro-competitive effects, and maybe that seems kind of second nature to the economists, but I think that you do see that there is that. I think that's where the disconnect is with on the legal side of things with the folks that don't have the economic training and who maybe haven't seen in practice as much how those efficiencies can actually translate to pro-competitive effects. So those are my thoughts on the paper.
Thank you very much, Maggie. It's good to hear some perspective from the US. Dan, are you here with us? Maybe it would be interesting to hear your initial thoughts, having the European perspective. I don't know.
Absolutely. And I think, Sylvia, I think you'll be not surprised to find that we're all facing pretty similar challenges. And well, first of all, I should also say to everyone on the phone, I greatly appreciate you all allowing just the three of us to convert this entire discussion into English for our benefit. So, obrigado. And that's the only Portuguese I know. But to kind of stick to the topic at hand, I do see frustrations over here on both sides. And I had a conversation in a small group not too long ago with the current chief economist, Pierre Rijbo, who kind of said, look, we're looking for an efficiencies case to clear, but so much of what we get, it comes in at the last minute. We don't have time to test it. The claims are bad, or they're just kind of trust us. We'll negotiate a better deal with our suppliers, and they find it very difficult. And they also feel kind of the same tension of incentives, which is practitioners on the other side saying, well, we don't want to highlight efficiencies too much because that suggests we're really desperate. Our case really needs the efficiencies. And that's not the approach we take. It's not the approach I take, but I think it is understandable given the kind of the incentive structure that we find ourselves with. And I want to talk about a couple. I mean, we've heard a little bit about asymmetries, but I want to talk about asymmetries along a couple other dimensions. I mean, one is I think putting aside whether we should weigh harms and pro-competitive efficiencies evidence, similarly. Right now, I think there's a big asymmetry between how we treat efficiencies and how we treat other evidence about how harms are going to occur. So, for example, if we have a market where there are 4 or 5 reasonably sized competitors, but the shares are quite high, they're 70, 80%, something like that. But it's a bidding market and capacity isn't too difficult to build. The parties aren't particularly close competitors. We see those kinds of transactions, those kinds of arguments about the expansion of smaller competitors, for some reason, get much more acceptance than claims about efficiencies. And it's not really clear to me why we should be more confident that that type of argument is less speculative than the fact that the parties will achieve some economies in their merger, as long as it's backed up by the right evidence. So I think there's this strange kind of asymmetry I see between the way we deal with other responsive even putting aside how we treat the parties' various burdens, how we treat other arguments about why harms aren't going to occur from efficiencies. Separately, I think we see this asymmetry that Jeremy highlighted at the top between how we treat efficiencies for deals that don't have as much concentration and how we treat them as for deals that have more concentration. And I think it kind of leads me to, Jeremy highlighted, look, we're basically assuming, if you do kind of a 6-to-5 deal, we're basically just assuming that you'll have efficiencies. You don't even have to explain anything, right? So you could just kind of wave your hands and say economies of scale, and people are like, oh, okay. And that's basically all the evidence you have to bring forward. Whereas if you want to do, a 4-to-3 merger, you have to bring, really, crazy level of proof to that deal. And I'm not really sure that's right. And so one thing I often hear when we're talking about efficiencies with people is this concern that, well, it's just going to be a way to let more deals through if we go down this road. And I actually think that's wrong, and quite wrong, because look, there just aren't that many 2-to-1, 3-to-2 deals, or even 4-to-3 deals that happen. There aren't that many that happen every year. And if we really think there's an under-enforcement problem, and we do want to be stricter about enforcement, the direction most of that is going to have to come in is being more aggressive with deals that lead to less concentration. And if we're going to do that and not do a huge amount of harm in an unintentional way, we're going to have to be more serious about efficiencies to be able to select from those the deals that, notwithstanding that the concentration isn't going up a huge amount, they just don't have any meaningful, opportunity for entry, repositioning, efficiencies. And there are good reasons to be a little stricter. We know that most deals, from the corporate law research, we know that most deals fail to accomplish, at least the stated synergies that we hear from Wall Street. So. There are reasons to be somewhat skeptical, but I think those reach down, into the smaller transactions, and we're not just talking about the giant mega mergers in which we have to do this. And to do that effectively, we just have to be more serious about working through these claims and having a more realistic standard for these claims. And kind of finally, I think some symmetry of incentives we have to take account of, and one area of that is, we hear this skepticism. Jeremy read from the beginning of the line from the horizontal merger guidelines in the United States about skepticism of efficiencies generated outside the normal business planning process. On the other hand, there's an asymmetry in kind of what we're expecting parties to show in order to say something's an efficiency, a cognizable efficiency, something that'll actually lead to lower prices, versus what those parties actually need in order to justify a transaction to their board. And we really shouldn't be surprised that different things matter for both of those analyses, right? So the board cares about making more money. They don't care whether something that is a synergy is a fixed cost reduction or a reduction in marginal cost. They certainly don't care about separating the two of those things from one another. And they care about a total number, right? And so, when we see a board focusing on, look, we know we can get these reductions in SG&A and headcount, for back office functions done. That's more than enough to pay for the premium on the transaction. We shouldn't be particularly shocked that the board didn't sit down and go through kind of an incremental cost analysis in order to justify. We shouldn't be that skeptical, that didn't occur. I think we just have to be a little bit more realistic about what different constituencies are looking for. And if we want parties to bring efficiencies of the kind that we as antitrust lawyers, economists, and agencies want, that are different from what business people are typically producing, then we have to expect that they might need to do a little bit of work just to do them for us. And we can't let that lead, to kind of unnecessary skepticism about the fact that they occur. So I don't know. I've introduced way too many axes of symmetry in a short period of time.
Okay.
I'll yield.
So, well, thank you, Dan. I think it's good to have to bear that in mind that, and it's something that Patricia also mentioned. It's interesting to assess efficiencies, to try to understand better what is motivating the deal, the transaction. So it shouldn't be taken into account only in the end of the investigation or only after concluding it is harmful or there is some danger of harmful. So one of the questions I would like to discuss with you is, we know that we have very high standards to be meet to have the efficiencies being accepted, and what if the efficiencies that are being presented doesn't meet all the criteria? Should we consider it or dismiss it at all just because they're not so, it's not so clear they are merger specific, or it's not so clear how it's going to be shared with consumers? How the authorities, especially maybe Jeremy and Patricia may start commenting this question, but how should we consider efficiencies if they do not meet all the criteria? Maybe Jeremy could start and then Patricia can comment on.
Sure. So yeah, it's a good question. This comes up a lot. We'll have an efficiency that seems credible, like it might happen, but there's concern about merger specificity, or we believe there's the agency believes there's a fixed cost savings, but is skeptical it's going to do anything for consumers because fixed cost savings may not be passed through. I mean, I think as a matter of logic, efficiency would need to be merger specific, verifiable, and passed through to consumers. Counted if definitely verified, but we're back to my example where it's the A side just owns a commonly available technology, the B side could just go to the store and buy it. A little skeptical, that the fact that it's verifiable should overcome the fact that it's not merger specific. Pass-through is kind of the interesting one because that is pass-through is an economic concept. It's not necessarily something we can verify from looking at business documents. I mean, there's a technical literature on pass-through. It has to do with the curvature of the demand function. The Jaffe and Weil paper from the economists that are on the call. So that's the hard one, and I'd be the most hesitant to have concerns about pass-through lead to dismissal of the efficiencies claim. If we're satisfied with verifiability and merger specificity, it would have to be overwhelming evidence it was unlikely to be passed through to get me to automatically just dismiss the claim, at least with something we thought would affect marginal cost. I mean, it's sort of a separate debate about whether fixed cost efficiency should or shouldn't have any impact on our on what we do. I think as a practical matter, it's pretty clear they don't. So I'll sort of leave fixed cost efficiencies to the side and talk about marginal cost efficiencies. And I would uncertainty about what fractionally pass through should not cause us to dismiss them. I mean, a monopolist with a downward sloping demand curve will pass through some fraction of efficiencies, as will a competitive firm.
Thank you, Patricia.
Okay, let me try to answer this maybe in an indirect way. So I think of merger analysis as a balancing act. So the decision, whether it be for a rejection of the case, approval or approval with restrictions, has to be solidly grounded on the evidence amassed during the merger analysis. In that sense, each of the aspects investigated constitute a pillar to sustain or to oppose the clearing of a merger, right? So ideally, we would want every pillar to be still sturdy. But of course, this is not the case. Every information carries with itself a degree of uncertainty. An efficiency claim that does not meet all the high standards to be accepted might not be fit to work as one of the sustaining pillars of a decision. But at the same time, it might be it might not be completely discarded. Yeah, so I am trying to sustain my decision, and I have some pillars. These are solid, these are sturdy. This other one is more or less, well, it doesn't fulfill all the requirements. So these efficiencies that meet only some of the criteria could potentially work as an auxiliary argument, an auxiliary pillar. So in that sense, this could be a practical way to try to handle this matter, which is not always black and white. Yeah. So regarding that, I'd like to comment on one aspect that Dan mentioned, is that maybe parties might see offering efficiency claims as an act of desperation. So for the Brazilian practitioners, please don't regard it as that. Actually, we would almost urge parties to bring efficiency claims from the very beginning. I think that in Brazil, we still have a hard time amassing documents regarding the operation. I think the situation is probably better in the US and in Europe. So during the notification, we usually spend a lot of time with the parties, asking them to present documents showing the rationale of the operation, and these documents are usually not enough, not sufficient, or very hard to believe that there is nothing more than that. So maybe you don't have to provide a very complete efficiency analysis with made by consultants and everything, but showing the efficiencies or the rationale of the operation better will certainly provide more ground for us to take into account even these aspects, these efficiencies that might not meet the standards for them to be accepted as counterbalancing upward pricing effects, but leaving them for the last minutes certainly is not a way to help that.
Understood. Yeah, I tend to agree that the sooner the better, in the sense that we also have more time to discuss with you the efficiencies. If you do not consider, if the authority is having hard time to consider them or to understand the figures, they have more time to interact and try to at least we try at least to meet the not speculative criteria. So the sooner tends to be the better in this case. And one of the issues related to that is that when we are discussing pass on, which is a very important criteria as far as I understand, is that usually the efficiencies are required when we are discussing the deal and you realize that the competition environment may lack of rivalry. So this is one of the motivation for the authority request efficiencies. But at the same time, in the lack of this rivalry, sometimes based on qualitative analysis, the lack of rivalry is also the reason why the authority will not consider the efficiency, because there will be no pass on in the understanding. This is sometimes qualitative analysis, and I think this may, sometimes we have the perception this may be also be a tautology, because the same reason that is driving the decision to request the efficiency is the same reason that is going to make the efficiencies being disregarded. So I would like to ask Dan and Maggie, how do they feel about that in Europe, in the US, if things happens in the same way there?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, you know, Maggie actually put her finger on it earlier, which is, and I don't think the situation is very much different on this respect in Europe and the US, but that there is a skepticism, especially from lawyers without economic training, that they'll actually be pass on unless there's kind of enough competition. And I think that, you know, when we're, as Jeremy mentioned, when we're talking about marginal cost savings, I don't think there's really a question about that in terms of an economic perspective, that, that those will be passed on to some degree. We may not know what the pass-through rate is, but one of the, I think, very important kind of, it was well known in economics before this, but one of the important ways that Farrell and Shapiro in their upward pricing pressure paper, I think, explained their methodology was to make it clear that at least when we're in a unilateral effects case, when we're talking about differentiated products, that the way that leads to a price increase is that when you lower your price, you're going to take some sales from your rival who you now own, right? Recapture. And that's basically like your cost went up, right? And that's what leads you to raise your price. And so if your costs go down, that counteracts that incentive. And so kind of, I think the core and very interesting and informative piece of that is that the pass-through rate that of that those recaptured sales into price increases is the same pass-through rate of reduced costs into price decreases. And so we actually don't need necessarily to have a great understanding of exactly what the cost pass-through rate is going to be itself to weigh those two things against one another, because it turns out that the cost pass-through rate being applied to each of them is the same. Now, that's not to say that every transaction is going to be that simple, especially if we're talking about coordinated effects, where I think trying to quantify both how harms work and how efficiencies apply to them is much more difficult. But, I think we do need to, get out there and then do a little more education and explanation about, how that does work, how that relationship between, at least on the unilateral effect side, the harms and the efficiencies really works. And that's one area where I think, having guidelines that explain that, that really helps, both to explain it to folks on the staff, in a persuasive way, but also to courts who don't deal with this every day, whether that be the kind of district court judge in the US in that litigation, or it be, a chamber of the general court who has, similarly generalist judges, maybe not necessarily with the economic background there. And so I think it's important that we get out and we explain that. I think the other piece that we run into the most is, I think, as Jeremy said, look, we're not going to totally discard wanting efficiencies to be verifiable and not speculative, or that there's not some easy way to go do what we're talking about without doing a deal. We're always going to have those requirements. I think the question is, how exacting are those requirements going to be? And too often, I think what we see is, for an efficiency to be verifiable, we see that means you have to be able to prove an exact amount with essentially certainty. And I just don't think that's realistic. And we have to recognize, look, zero is just another number. It's not any more precise, right, than anything else. It's just as arbitrary. And when we know that there's some chance, it's a problem not to try to put an estimate on it. And I think we would do a lot better to focus, and this is where guidance, I think, could be really helpful. We do a lot better to focus on what are the kind of things that are just more likely to happen in terms of producing real efficiencies than, right? And so, when we have somebody come forward and they make, the really high quality version of the product, but they have a plant on the Pacific Ocean, and we have another person who makes a lower quality but super low cost version of the product, but their plant is on the Atlantic Ocean. And with some small tweaks, they could make one another's product, but now, there's patents, trade secrets, et cetera, right? Okay, well, when they come together, you could really see how we'll just start, we'll switch half of the production of one to the other ocean and half of one to the other, and we're going to have pretty big logistics savings, and we can be pretty confident that's going to happen, right? I mean, if there is demand from people everywhere for those products kind of in equal measure. So I think we ought to be pretty welcoming of that kind of efficiency. We ought to be pretty sure that that's going to happen if people bring together those kinds of stories to us. On the other hand, if it's just some vague promise that we're really better at running this business than everybody else, we'll apply our best practices to the other company, or well, trust us, we'll get a better deal from our suppliers because we have more. Okay, those we ought to be a lot more skeptical of, right? And so I think we can kind of lay that out. We could be a lot more kind of precise about like what are the things we really find persuasive, and usually it has this component, and I find it's the most persuasive when I present it. One party has A, the other party has B, and this party's missing B, and this party's missing A. So, to do something good, right? And if we have that complementarity story, usually we can, have something that really feels credible and produces, more from less. And that's really what it's all about. So that to me is kind of the better way of calibrating what we need in terms of not being speculative.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely with what Dan is saying on guidance that I think would be really helpful to help bring some of the economic concepts into practice of why it is that we should assume pass through and all of those things. I mean, it's interesting thinking about what Dan was just discussing about how exacting the standards are and how we build them in. I mean, you think about when it comes to potential anti-competitive effect. I always think about, especially if you're ultimately going to a court, but you basically have three pillars of evidence, right? You have economic evidence, you have documentary evidence, and you have testimonial evidence. And that in order to tell your story, you need all three of those. And I think you may not be able to have efficiencies. This, I guess, goes back to the question that Jeremy and Patricia were answering before. When you have efficiencies that don't meet all the criteria, but there's obviously something there. I mean, that there's every reason in the world why you should be able to still have kind of different pillars of evidence for pro-competitive effects and for efficiencies, explaining. Being able to show that there is, for example, contemporaneous documentation within the company talking about these benefits, that you don't necessarily, efficiencies don't always need to be quantified, to the last dime to be able to be given credibility. Even if they're not, even if you can't do that, there should be a way for you to use those as evidence in other ways. And so, which I think mainly goes a lot to the transaction rationale. I mean, that's always something that you go through when you're discussing a merger and engaging with the regulator about what the rationale is. And a lot of time that the kind of transaction rationale is one way to show this is not about raising prices. But I think that's the general category this would fit into when you're trying to explain the reasons for a merger. If it doesn't exactly fit in, you can't exactly quantify all of it. But I agree. I mean, there should be ways to submit persuasive evidence of efficiencies that may not be precisely quantifiable, but that are intuitive almost in the examples that Dan was giving, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Dan. Very interesting points. I do have more questions and comments to share with you, but before that, I would like to open for questions from the audience. I don't know if someone here has any questions. If you do, just open your camera and you can do it. We do not have problem with that. Or you can share the comment in the chat if you prefer. Well,
Raise your hand.
Or raise your hand, whatever you prefer. So I'll leave the audience thinking about a question to be done, and I'll move forward with discussing the standards. I do agree with you guys that having more clear standards would be very helpful for us to develop a more accurate analysis. And one very important standard is the merger-specific one. Commissioner Wilson, in her paper, said something like only gains that could be realized by either independent firm should be discounted as a not merger specific. So should you consider a synergy not merger specific if it could be achieved by organic growth or with a hypothetical different merger? So in general terms, if you say, okay, this kind of synergy could be achieved with another merger that is not the one that you're discussing now, so this is not a merger specific, or the parties could achieve the same amount of synergies, only growing organically. What do you think about these kind of gains? They should be considered specific or not merger specific. Maybe Jeremy could bring his point of view, then Patricia, and maybe Dan and Maggie make some small comments as well regarding this topic.
Just to add a comment here, this kind of question of could this kind of efficiency be obtained with another deal? It always strikes me as a speculative question. So, what kind of deal? It's a hypothetical deal. I just always feel like weird about this. Just to add a comment.
Yeah.
Sure. So I'll go first here. It's a good question. I mean, I think with let's take the case of organic growth, and the A side is going to do something to the B side that's going to cause the B side to develop new products and/or lower costs. There's some evidence the B side would be able to do this on its own. So, I mean, maybe it had a research program in place. It hadn't resulted. It hadn't borne any fruits yet. But it was possible that the B side would kind of serendipitously stumble on the breakthrough and be able to develop some new technology itself. That's certainly worth taking into consideration. If an agency deems the B side as likely to achieve the same savings or develop the same technology itself that the A side already has, then it should discount it to some extent. The fact that the B side has not yet achieve the savings or develop the technology is probably indicative of, or it says something about the likelihood the B side would achieve that on its own. And I think often at the FTC we run into the case where maybe the efficiencies the A side speed something up. So something may kind of naturally happen. The technology moves in only one direction, and over time the B side is going to figure out some new technology or some better production process to lower costs, but the A side can do it quicker. And so the B side will get better technology or lower cost for 2 or 3 years, and then maybe it would have caught up to where the A side is anyways. Maybe that's a fact pattern. That's not irrelevant. That's not a reason to discount the claim at all, it seems to me. I mean, so consumers would benefit from that efficiency for the 2 or 3 years it would take for the B side to catch up to the A side. And of course, in my hypothetical, after 2 or 3 years, the A side may have moved on and may have yet better technology. So speeding up the timing of technology or cost savings doesn't seem irrelevant to me. So that's kind of the thing I would say about organic growth. I mean, in terms of could there be another acquisition that would have achieved the same efficiency? I mean, I touched on this in my opening remarks. It's there may be cases where that's reason to discount an efficiency claim. We've had cases where the claimed efficiency is the A side has a lot of money, and the B side needs money to do stuff, to develop products and do research and development. And I'm this is a slight caricature of the arguments parties made, but I mean, if that's a claim to efficiency, the A side has a lot of money, we can give some money to the B side. Yeah, okay. I mean, you could probably do that through not only another merger, but through other means, such as selling stock, getting investment from a venture capital fund. So I don't want to say there are no cases where we would be skeptical of an efficiency because it could be achieved by other means. But I think as a general matter, if the A side can do some really complicated thing and they can teach it to the B side and modernize the B side's techniques, the fact that there's a third company that maybe also knows how to do this really complicated modern thing and could also teach it to the B side seems irrelevant from the point of view of evaluating the efficiencies from A buying B, because we don't know anything about the likelihood of this hypothetical merger between this other company that knows this advanced stuff. So I'll turn it over to Patricia with that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let me go back to the fact that we are also discussing the possibility of having guidelines, right? So I think the benefits of having guidelines comes from following them, right? Because if we have them and they are being followed, they provide some certainty. And so in that sense, I would say that if efficiencies do not follow the standards that are provided in the guidelines for them to be accepted, then it would be better for us to stick to what the guidelines are saying, so that they can indeed, so that these guidelines can provide what they're expected to provide, which is this certainty, this procedures, how everything is going to be handled and treated. Having said that, I also to point that before joining the superintendents, I worked at the Department of Economic Studies, which is responsible for a lot of the more complex quantitative analysis undertaken at CADE. And since then, we have argued for a qualitative-quantitative approach. So in fathoming any phenomena, we use different sources of data, different sources of evidences. So efficiencies that might not be accepted, or that might not be quantifiable, might not be accepted to counterbalance, for example, UPP results. But then at the same time, this does not mean that they will not be taken into account. So what I'm saying is that we have worked hard to establish some rules, some guidelines that can offer us the principles on which we will base our decisions. And the guidelines, they offer security. At the same time, they take some of our freedom. Yeah. If we start moving too much out of these guidelines, then the guidelines become useless, right? At the same time, given these principles, which is assessing competition, assessing what the effects of this merger will be, maybe we will not be able to take these efficiencies claims to counterbalance these UPP results. We could do this with efficiency scenarios, for example, but I'm not offering as well a very rigid rule. Like, I'm not going to take into account any efficiencies if they don't fulfill all of these requirements. I'm just saying that yes, I think that we have to stick to what has been stated as the principles, but then we also